Hi everyone. This week we will be talking about settlement agreements and specifically tactics. So, how to maximise the use and benefits of settlement agreements without necessarily just looking at that top line figure. The background to this is that we are seeing a little bit more restructuring in recent weeks, and possibly as we move towards the end of the furlough scheme and the end of the current period of restrictions. In some cases, as opposed to undertaking the full formal restructure process, businesses are having more discussions on a without prejudice basis to try and achieve a negotiated settlement with staff. So, the aim of this video is to talk through what we might include in settlement agreements above and beyond pure compensation. And the first area we will look at is the notice period. So, if you have a particularly senior employee or even long serving, the notice period may be 3 months, might even be 6 months. One benefit to the employee is not having to work that period, and that can be presented as a benefit to them. If we're paying in lieu of notice, the employee will have the benefit of arguably being able to move on immediately, look for other work, start another job, and possibly make quite a tidy profit. Alternatively, and particularly in sales roles, we might want to place the employee on garden leave instead for the notice period. From our perspective, we get the benefit of a break in customer contact, and from the employee's perspective, they get to enjoy hopefully a nice warm summer without having to come into work. In both cases, the current tax position is that money would have to be subject to tax and national insurance contributions, but it does present a benefit to the employee. References, again, for particularly long-serving employees, having a detailed, subjective, favourable reference to take with them to other employment is a real benefit. You don't want a black hole in your employment, and it's not particularly useful just to have an objective reference that sets out the dates of employment and job role. So that is something that can be negotiated. On that note, a report was prepared in a couple of years ago now that talked about introducing a statutory obligation on employers to provide at least a basic factual reference. In some regulated sectors, there is an obligation to do so, but at the moment, it is really for the employer to decide on whether they want to do that or not. In conjunction with that, it might be beneficial to agree an announcement. And again, another benefit that can be presented to employees. We can give them the option of shaping how they frame their exit. And again, for particularly long-serving and proud employees who want a good legacy when they go, giving them some input on the wording that we might want to use with other staff can be seen as a benefit. Company property. In many cases, employees ask to keep their mobile phones or laptops. I think subject to some security and confidentiality issues, getting those items wiped, for example, it can be a good benefit just to transfer over the number to a personal contract for the employee. And again, a little bit of a thank you and a goodwill gesture as opposed to paying significant compensation. The position gets a little bit more tricky when we're talking about a company car, because there are tax implications of transferring something that is so expensive as a benefit. So you will need to take specific advice on that. Just be aware that the return of any property, so if, for example, we're allowing the company car to be used for another 6 months beyond termination, some strict provisions should be put in place about the return of that property and possibly also the state that it should be returned in. And any arrangements in the meantime, such as who's insuring, taxing, putting fuel into the vehicle, that sort of thing. We might also look at negotiating reduced restrictive covenants. So the employee may have signed a contract of employment which has particularly onerous restrictions such as non-compete. As part of our negotiating position, we could introduce the possibility of reducing the length of the covenants, the scope, taking out a non-compete entirely if we're just wanting to rely on non-solicitation provisions. but that can be a significant barrier to employees obtaining alternative employment if they remain bound by the most severe of restrictions. Tax efficiency is another issue. It has become more difficult now in light of the post-employment notice pay calculations that businesses have to run, which has really restricted what we can do with the notice payment. But setting a termination date at some point into the future before a notice payment kicks in is not particularly helpful from a tax perspective. The sooner we can remove an employee in terms of the termination date, the more we can load into the ex gratia payment, and the more of a benefit the employee will have. Similarly, an employee might ask for part of their ex gratia payment to be made directly into the pension scheme. You'll have to look at the rules of that scheme and any annual allowance to make sure an employee hasn't exceeded that. But again, that could prevent a tax advantageous benefit to both parties potentially. In terms of the general tax position on ex gratia payments, there is a £30,000 tax-free limit. Again, that does exclude the notice pay. But as we've discussed, it isn't necessarily all about the money, and employees may have various different wants and objectives in terms of their settlement. So it might be just worth on a case-by-case basis looking at the employee, their personal circumstances. For example, are they close to retirement? Would they, benefit as a long server from a very detailed announcement, a tax advantageous payment, the retention of a little bit of property, to tide them over until they got a new car, for example. If it's a younger sales-driven employee who needs to stay in the industry, do we look at watering down the restrictive covenants? But hopefully this video has shown that there are a number of things that you can do in a negotiated settlement position, which would avoid just having to look at the numbers and increase your financial liability. If you do have any specific queries or tactics that you want to talk through, please do get in touch with us. If you visit the website chadwicklawrence.co.uk, you can find more resources and videos and our contact details, or email employmenthub@chavlaw.co.uk. Thank you.